Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about this very interesting therapy that was recently conducted using an extremely interesting technique. And it involved eyes, or actually vision. It involved a patient that hasn't seen anything for close to about 40 years and was able to finally see something. But as always, this story kind of starts with me trying to figure out why this article was trending online and why is it that it wasn't really explained correctly. This one here is from BBC News, and it essentially talked about this genetic experiment that helped this 58-year-old man who had a very unusual and very rare genetic condition known as retinitis pigmentosa. This one affects roughly around 1 in 4,000 people around the planet, and it's a detrimental genetic condition that causes a person to slowly lose vision over time, eventually turning the retina of the person with this condition into what you see right here in the picture. Now the thing about this condition is that because it's genetic and because it's sort of inherited, normally it's extremely difficult to treat. But the scientists behind this paper, you can find in the description below, found a very intriguing and very interesting experimental therapy that allowed this patient to actually be able to perceive things by using a technique known as optogenetics. And this is actually what makes this really interesting. This seems to be the first official case of optogenetics being used on humans. And this is exactly what makes this study so intriguing and so interesting. But first of all, so genetic therapy. Even though it might sound a little bit scary, this therapy obviously involves somehow modifying the DNA itself to try to improve persons, or I guess animals' condition. Or essentially it tries to fix everything at the source. It tries to fix things through the DNA itself. Now this might sound a little bit scary, but it's a very interesting technique that's been used for decades now, with the first official attempts being made back in 1980s, and the first official trials that were successful being by a scientist by the name of French Anderson, who performed them back in the 90s. And normally these techniques are applied when the gene itself is malfunctioning in some way or another. Basically it's not performing its actual role. So in the case of vision, for example, the retina is not developed correctly and ends up not functioning as it does in other humans, and because of this, over years and decades, the person can become completely blind. But hypothetically, you could maybe deliver the correct gene to the retina of a person and treat it that way. This actually has been done in children, and back in 2008, several children were treated for this particular disorder by using DNA therapy, by using gene therapy, and it was successful, and they can actually see today. But unfortunately, this would not work for someone who's in their 50s, who's almost 60 actually. Mostly because, well, first of all, the retina has already stopped producing new molecules and is not going to be repairing itself at all, and so this person here would be stuck with permanently damaged vision. The thing about retina, or in this case a lot of other cells in our eyes, is that unlike other cells in our body, they do not really reproduce anymore. They're produced once and they stay with us for life. Now that's a bit unfortunate because it makes it very difficult to repair them. And so for an older person with a genetic condition, it becomes practically impossible to repair their vision, at least genetically speaking. You can maybe somehow transplant a retina, but that's not something that the scientists are able to do just yet. At the same time, because retinal cells tend to be produced just once in a lifetime, and because they stay with us for life and do not reproduce anymore, once you actually apply genetic therapy to those cells, they do not affect any other cells around them, and because of this, this makes this particular genetic therapy extremely safe. It means that the therapy that you apply to those cells is not going to be going around the body affecting other cells. It's only going to affect the cells in your eyes. And so as of today, the majority of gene therapies have actually been eye-based. They've always been sort of focusing on the eye disorders. Now, not all of them, but the majority of them are. Interestingly enough, one of the first drugs to be approved, which is based on genetic modification, and it's actually approved by FDA and is sold under the name Luxturna, is a gene therapy drug that tries to solve that issue that was treated in children back in 2008. And so this is actual therapy that already exists. And just if you were wondering how it works, well, they always use the same method. They use viruses, and specifically a virus such as the adenovirus that is then injected with various types of genetic material and is then responsible for infecting our cells and introducing these genes into the cell. And though it doesn't always work for some of the other cells, especially the ones that normally reproduce and divide a lot, for the eye cells, for the retinal cells, it works really well, because those cells have already been created. By delivering these types of genes into those cells, It allows for an actual functioning protein to be produced and for those eye cells to start functioning as they were supposed to. And so this type of therapy already exists, it's very effective, and it's probably one of the most useful genetic therapies currently in use on humans. But that's not exactly what happened in this particular study, because what happened there is even more fascinating. It still involves genetic modification, it still involves adenoviruses delivering something into the eye cells, but that something was not genetic material that was supposed to treat something. As I mentioned before, this person was already much older, so his eyes were already beyond repair. The scientists in this case used an extremely interesting method known as optogenetics. And this method is based on something scientists realized by looking at various types of algae. Algae has a tendency to move toward the light. And when the scientists realized that the algae does this by using something extremely similar to how neurons work, they realized that hypothetically you could modify a certain gene in those neurons and then have light affect those particular neurons. In other words, by changing certain genes and then sending them through a virus into, for example, a rat, they learned how to activate those certain neurons by using a very specific light, for example in this case, blue light. And here's actually a really good visual example on how this works. So the neurons inside this worm known as nematode are actually changed through this technique. Notice how it completely freezes, it stops its activity when the light is turned on. In this case it's green light. When the light is off, it continues moving. When the light is on, it completely freezes. And that's what makes this extremely interesting. It allows the scientists to physically control the activity of neurons by just shining the light on them. And here's what all of this looks like on the inside if you were to zoom in. So as soon as the light is on, the activity is turned on and the worm in this case starts to contract its muscles. But this can obviously be done with a lot of different creatures that have similar components on the inside. For example, here's an experiment using a fly. In this case, when the light is shown here, the neurons responsible for activating the fly turn on and the fly starts flying. In other words, the light here acts as a kind of a switch. It can also be used on heart cells. In this case, it activates the beating of the heart inside the mouse heart cells. And it can even be used on skin cells, in this case guiding the skin cells in a certain direction. But it's also been quite extensively used on various rats, where it's also been helping rats with certain brain disorders, such as Alzheimer's. In this case, this is a very interesting technique that seems to be a lot more accurate than electrical stimulation that can be used to activate specific cells in a rat's brain. It's been used to, for example, help certain rats that could not walk to start walking again. And so being able to control neurons and actually other cells as well by using certain light is exactly what makes this technique so interesting. And this is what they were able to use in this particular patient. They injected this patient with genes responsible for turning his retina cells into basically like these little switches that only turn on when certain light is shown on them. And so the eyes of this patient that were already damaged beyond repair were turned into a kind of a light switch. When a certain light of a certain wavelength was shown on them, they would activate and turn on the retina cells. And interestingly enough, when the scientists ran the experiment by giving this patient a specific type of goggles, the goggles that you see right here, whose purpose was to basically shine a specific type of a light onto the retina in specific locations, thus acting as the on switches for his retina cells, to the surprise of scientists, suddenly this person could actually start perceiving certain objects. Now, it was a very simple experiment with very simple results so far, but it's a very promising experiment. By placing a cup right in front of the person, this system allowed this person to finally perceive the object after literally decades of not seeing anything. And considering that this person could only actually see tiny bits of light before that, this was a huge improvement. Now remember, this was only just activating the retina cells. It was not really improving his vision in any way, and it's not really improving the retina inside the eye at all. As a matter of fact, the retina is still kind of damaged as it was before. But now it's able to react to a specific light that's sent into the eyes through those goggles. And so it's those goggles sending the light that allow the person to finally see objects. And so this particular achievement is really impressive. Optogenetics already has so many different potential applications in treating a lot of other problems, but in this case the scientists actually showed that you could hypothetically help the person with completely unrepairable vision finally see again, something that was practically impossible only a few years ago. But this is obviously just the beginning. Now, optogenetics is still in its infancy and there are still quite a lot of things for us to learn about this technique. And it's also important to remember that any kind of a gene therapy is still extremely difficult to achieve in some of the other disorders, like for example, things like Alzheimer's or even heart disease, which are sometimes genetic, would be practically impossible to treat with a simple DNA modification simply because so many different genes and so many different cells are involved. At the moment, this makes this technique very limited in its application, but the fact that we can actually already find several potential disorders that can be treated with this technique is really promising. And so in that sense, it's super exciting to see where the scientists take this in the next few years. About 10 years ago, when this technique was just sort of announced and was only being explored as a potential treatment, a lot of scientists were actually speculating that this could be used for various treatments. And this study definitely showed that this technique is very promising in allowing us to treat something that was previously impossible. But anyway, for now that's kind of all we know, and that's all that the scientists in this paper were able to achieve. Check out the paper and all of the relevant videos from Nature magazine in the description below, and maybe subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves to learn about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Consider supporting this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.